we are live. Yeah.
Greetings to everyone present. On behalf of the SFI unit of St Stephens College, I welcome you all to a lecture by Comrade Vijay Prashad on Palestinian liberation and how it is inevitable and irresistible. Comrade Prasad is a historian and Marxist intellectual. He is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books. Some of his prominent works include "Untouchable Freedom", a social history of the Dalit community; "Poorer Nations", a possible history of the Global South; "The Darker Nations", a people's history of the Third World; "Letters to Palestine", etc. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that SFI St Stephens contents the college's recent collaboration with the Israeli Embassy and the Yad Vashem Center, the director of which has been previously convicted for several instances of human rights violation in the Gaza Strip. As a part of this collaboration, the college has decided to offer a 4 sessions long seminar on the Holocaust. Academic collaboration with the settler colonial regime of Israel not only serves as a sanction to its genocide against the Palestinians, but also its use of the Holocaust as a sympathy maneuver, which itself is disrespectful to the memory of Holocaust victims. The lecture has been organized in and dedicated to the memory of Comrade Satyam Shah. Satyam was a member of the organizing committee of SFI St Stephens College. He succumbed to COVID-19 on the 25th of May 2021. Satyam was deeply passionate about the Palestinian cause and was a strong critic of the Israeli occupation. Had he been here with us today, he would no doubt have rallied for Palestinian freedom. He would have been very keen to hear Mr. Prasad's address, given that he was an admirer of the academic publications of the leftward books. I now hand over the platform to Comrade Prasad. Over to you, sir.
So Maya, that was first a very beautiful opening statement, and I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to the Student Federation of India, St. Stephen's branch. Grateful very much to the memory of your comrade whose work and inspiration must continue to shine a light for all students. I'm very grateful that the students in St. Stephen's and in other parts of India have their eye on what's happening in Palestine. It appears to me now that the students of India are more clear-sighted about the issue of Palestine and the government of India. During this most recent bombing by Israel of Gaza and the violations of international law in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, during this period, India's Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson Arindam Bagchi had the limited intelligence to say that, look, firstly, there was no condemnation from the Indian government, but he had the limited intelligence to say that India is closely following, and then the word he used is, India is closely following developments on the Israel-Palestine issue. Now, I want to start with this because I want to clarify for you that there is no issue here. Issue is an extremely empty word. Issue, it could be used for anything. It's an extremely empty word. Massive, disproportionate, asymmetrical bombardment of the Gaza Strip, evictions of people against the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the Indian government says we're closely following this issue. It's not an issue. I watched several news channels, Indian news channels reporting what's going on, and they use the term conflict. You see, a conflict means there are two equivalent parties involved here. Two equivalent parties. There are not. By international law, you don't have two equivalent parties engaging each other in either East Jerusalem, the West Bank, or in the Gaza Strip. What you have is you have an occupation of the Palestinian people. You have an occupation. Israel, as a member state of the United Nations, has certain obligations under international law towards those whom it has occupied, namely the Palestinian people. It has obligations. One of the obligations is not to change the status of areas that have been occupied, including East Jerusalem, a declared occupied territory declared by the United Nations Resolution 242, declares it's an occupied territory. Israel has an obligation not to change the facts on the ground. Same with the West Bank. The settlement policy is illegal based on international law. They are both, that is, the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and the settlements in the West Bank, are contrary to the Fourth Geneva Convention, and therefore they are war crimes. There is no conflict here. There are no issues here. There is merely the occupation by Israel of the Palestinian people. We have to be very clear about this. There are no two sides to this. Palestine didn't start this event. I'm going to come back to that whole business about rockets. Palestine didn't start this event. These various atrocities begin and are grounded in the occupation of Palestine by Israel. So that's the first point I want to make. And I would like this point to be made to Arindam Bagchi at the Ministry of External Affairs. I'd like this point made to the Indian government, that the Indian government needs to not depart from the norms of international law, from the UN Charter. The Indian government must not depart from those norms. And in a sense, and I say this with the highest respect, in a sense, neither should the administration at St. Stephens College. A college in the 21st century must abide by the norms of international law, must abide by the norms of the UN Charter. To have any collaboration, it's up to them, it's their purview, it's their right. On the other hand, while walking away from the norms of international law is a serious infraction, not only on legal grounds, but also moral grounds. And I would suggest to the administration of St. Stephens College that it rethink having the kind of collaboration that it's put on the table. I want to do a little digression to go into the question of anti-Semitism, to go into the question of the Holocaust, because that's right here on the table with the Bad Yashim Center and so on. Now, let's be fair about something. Anti-Semitism does not have its roots in Palestine. It does not have its roots in the Levant region of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean. It doesn't have its roots in the Arab world. Anti-Semitism as a grotesque ideology has its roots in Europe. And in fact, all the principal terminology that we use now about oppression comes out of the history of anti-Semitism. For instance, the term ghetto doesn't come from the United States, doesn't come from Palestine. The term ghetto comes from Venice, from 1516, when the Venetians, the Italians, placed people of Jewish faith into one particular part of the city and garrisoned them there. That was the Venetian ghetto. The idea of the ghetto goes from Italy, travels up to the Tsarist Empire, into Poland and so on. And you start seeing ghettos, or the Pale. The other word they use is the Pale. This is where Jews were put in a segregated way and faced great oppression, everyday life, for hundreds of years inside Europe. The first term is the term ghetto. It's a European term. It comes from Italian and it travels into the rest of Europe. The second term is the term pogrom. Pogrom comes from Russian. It's the terrible violence inflicted on Jews in Poland, in parts of Russia, during the Tsarist Empire, during the Polish kingdoms and so on. It was European violence against Jews for hundreds of years that gives us the term ghetto, placing a part of people of Jewish faith, and then the pogrom, the terrible violence inflicted on these populations, on religious grounds, on cultural grounds. This is a European problem, and it comes to a head in the Holocaust of the 1940s, when largely, mainly people of Jewish faith were murdered by the Nazi regime and their allies, including in Croatia and in Poland and in Hungary and in Romania and so on. Ghastly, ghastly mass murder of Jewish people. That was not something that took place in Palestine. That didn't take place in the Arab world, not in the Eastern Mediterranean. That takes place in the heart of Europe. Not only does it take place in the heart of Europe, but other European countries colluded with the mass murder of Jewish people. And they colluded in several different ways. One is they prevented Jewish migration or people fleeing from the Nazi regime. They prevented it. There's a famous ship of fools, the St. Louis, that tries to dock in Miami Harbor in the 1930s is turned away. The people on that ship, the Jewish people on that ship, went back to Germany and they were mostly killed. That was a European problem. That was a problem of the United States. That was not a problem of the Palestinians, other Arabs, not a problem of the Iranians. No, there was no anti-Semitism there. The word ghetto is not an Arabic word. The word pogrom is not an Arabic word. The word Holocaust is not an Arabic word. Holocaust comes from the Greek. It means burnt offering, a grotesque notion. The Hebrew word is Shoah, much tenderer, kinder, because actually human beings were killed. Not only people of Jewish faith, although the majority were Jews, but homosexuals were killed, gypsies were killed, and of course the communists were killed in those terrible camps that were mostly liberated by the Soviet Red Army. The Soviet Red Army comes in and liberates those camps. When the Allies, the British particularly, had a chance to bomb the rail lines, having been given intelligence by Swedish intelligence operatives, when the British had a chance to bomb the rail lines that took train after train of people to be killed in the Holocaust, they didn't. They chose not to bomb those rail lines. They preferred to use their armaments for military purposes. They were afraid the Soviets would get to the Nazis before them. They had the intelligence to do it. They didn't do it. Anti-Semitism is a European problem. Europe never accounted for it. Europe never properly accounted for the Holocaust. It's telling that Aimé Césaire, the great Caribbean writer, Marxist writer, poet, in his discourse on colonialism, opens the poem by saying, listen, this thing that you did in Germany, in Poland, and so on, this Holocaust has been visited upon us as colonialism for hundreds of years beforehand. Concentration camps, we had them in South Africa. We had concentration camps in the colonies. What was Jallianwala Bagh? That violence, that terrible violence, or the enforced famine in 1943 in Bengal, what was that but a kind of Holocaust? Aimé Césaire writes, what you are experiencing now in Europe, we have already experienced. He's introducing the discourse of colonialism into the events that took place in the 1940s, but that's also inadequate. Because in fact, what happens in the Holocaust isn't colonialism's bad cousin coming back into Europe. No, what happened in the Holocaust is based on hundreds of years of persecution of Jews inside Europe. That's where it comes from. Yet, after World War II, rather than settling accounts with its own hideous past of anti-Semitism, Europe exported the problem of anti-Semitism into the Levant, to Palestine. And they made the Palestinians pay the cost for the Holocaust. The Europeans never paid a cost for the Holocaust. They made the Palestinians pay the cost for the Holocaust, because the Holocaust didn't end in 1945. It continues into 1948 in the Nakba, when 700,000 Palestinians were thrown out of their house and land and sent into exile. The Nakba of 1948 is part and parcel of the history of the Holocaust. It's not something separate from that. It's Europe's unfinished business, because Europe and the United States did not pay the price for what Europe did to Jews, not just from 1939 to 1945, but from the 16th century, if not earlier, to 1945. Europe never paid the cost for that. It's a European problem. Europe needs to look itself in the eye and understand its historical anti Semitism and its terrible violence, the pogroms, the ghettos, and so on of European history. But rather than pay the price for that in Europe, Europe defrays the cost in classic colonial fashion, sends its own toxic history to play out in the Levant, where Jews are sent out of Europe to go and settle in the Levant so that the so-called Judenfrage, the Jewish question inside Europe, is no longer a European problem, but now is sent out and becomes a Levantine problem. That's the first point I want to make for you. We need to understand the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, the ejection of Palestinians from their lands. We need to understand the Nakba as a direct part of the history of the Holocaust. It's Europe essentially exporting its problem into the Levant. Anti-Semitism is not an Arab problem. It's not a Palestinian problem. It's not in the history of Iran. It's in the history of Europe. So we've got to point our fingers where they need to be pointed. That's the first point. Now, in 1948, Palestinians are thrown out of the Levant area, out of Palestine. This is called, as I said, the Nakba, a term first used, or at least in published form, by Konstantin Zorayek in 1948, in a very moving book that he wrote about the Nakba. In 1949, there are lines of armistice lines drawn around Palestine, and those lines become effectively Israel. Inside the armistice lines are a large number of Palestinians who are not sent into exile, and I'll return to them. But they are the first population of Palestinians that we have to consider. The second population of the Palestinians are those who are sent into permanent exile from 1948 till now. That's the second set. The third set are Palestinians who live in three parts of territory contiguous to the 1949 armistice lines. And those are Palestinians who live on the western flank of the Jordan River up to the 1949 armistice lines, and that is now known as the West Bank. Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, which after 1949, both the West Bank and East Jerusalem were under the control of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, a kingdom manufactured by the British Empire, and then a small piece of land adjacent to the Mediterranean, which is Gaza. These are the three areas which were held at the time from 1949 till 1967 by Jordan, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Gaza by Egypt and the United Nations, in fact, more the United Nations. In 1967, Israel prosecutes a war against Egypt and to some extent against Jordan, and seizes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. These then, by UN Resolution 242, become known as the Occupied Palestinian Territory. So at the end of 1967, there are three sets of fragmented Palestine. There are the Palestinians who are within Israel, the 1949 armistice lines. There are Palestinians who are in the occupied Palestinian territories, that is West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And then there are Palestinians in diaspora, in exile. And they are all over the world. They are in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, and in Chile. 500,000 Palestinians in the country of Chile, far away in the southern cone of the Americas. So these are the three fragmented sections of Palestine. Since 1967, there's been an consistent attempt to unify Palestinians to fight for their necessary liberation. And from 1967 till the present, the United Nations General Assembly has routinely come together, punctually, annually come together to stand on behalf of the Palestinians for their national liberatory aspirations, because they desire a national project and a solution to the occupation of Palestine by Israel. There have been many different theories advanced by the Palestinians of what this solution would look like. One, as you know, is the two-state solution, which was developed out of the Oslo process from 1994, establishing a Palestinian Authority. This would mean that these three areas of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza would become the Palestinian state, a state of Palestine, conceding the fact that the 1949 Israeli armistice lines would become an Israel. A sticking point in the two-state theory is what happens to the Palestinians who live outside. Do they have a right of return, which is established by the United Nations in Resolution 194, passed just after the Nakba? Where do they have a right to return to? Do Palestinians outside Palestine have a right to return only to the state of Palestine, or also to Israel, from which they had been ejected in 1948? That's a sticking point in the two-state solution. The other approach is a one-state solution, the call for from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea to have just one non-Jewish state, a democratic, secular, liberal state, where everybody is a citizen. This proposition is highly unrealistic because the Israeli government, particularly the Zionist political bloc, which is the majority of political parties, believes that Israel is a Jewish state. And if half the population are Palestinians, perhaps even more than half, the character of the Jewish state will be eroded. In a sense, the Israeli project is an ethno-nationalist state. It is a religious and ethnic state. It's not a secular state. It's not a liberal state. It is, in that sense, a ethnocratic state. It is a state of an ethnic community. And the one-state solution is totally unacceptable to the Israeli project, the Zionist project, which is principally about maintaining an ethnocratic state. And then the other project that is available, so if the preferred Palestinian alternative is some sort of two-state solution, there's a utopian idea on the table of a one state, which is totally rejected by the Zionists. And then there's a three-state solution or a 22-state solution, which is the preferred Zionist answer. And that is to make life for Palestinians so uncomfortable, both inside Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories, that Palestinians will then leave and go to the three states of Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, or the 22 states of the Arab world, that they will all be ejected. So there's a great number of discussions and proposals on the table. Initially, after 1967, the Palestinian position was that Palestine must be reestablished because of the weakness of the Palestinian cause in terms of the military power. Israel was able to dominate militarily not only the Palestinians, but the neighboring Arab states, cut peace agreements with Jordan and then with Egypt, a significant blow to the Palestinian cause. The weakening of the Palestinians led to the acknowledgement of a two-state proposition. The one-state solution idea comes because the two states seem to be so impossible to put in place given Israel's encroachment into the occupied Palestinian territory, the building of settlements, illegal settlements in the West Bank, and the theft of East Jerusalem, egged on by the United States government, which has moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The attempted seizure of Jerusalem, a highly contentious, sensitive issue that, if you want, we can talk about later. The reason I'm telling you all this is just to lay out the land, that there is a fragmented Palestine, Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinians in diaspora. Each of these Palestinian communities have had different, in a sense, histories of struggle. The Palestinians in exile from 1948 onward begin a political life in exile, starting, with a kind of diplomatic attempt to bring attention to the cause of the Palestinian people, eventually in the formation in exile of the group Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, who grows up in Gaza, goes to Kuwait. Many of the Fatah leadership meet in Kuwait. They create Fatah, and that leads to the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. PLO created 1964. This is largely driven from exile, from the camps of Jordan, the camps of Lebanon, and so on. So the exile population begins a political movement almost from the day they stepped out of historic Palestine to go into exile. And they have not stopped their political aspirations. Secondly, after the Naksa, the setback of 1967, after the Naksa of 1967, Palestinians inside the occupied Palestinian territory have developed a very strong political agenda, political life to end the occupation. And to end the occupation by different means, by joining some of these political organizations, whether it's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or Fatah and so on. A political identity develops inside the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza to fight against the occupation precisely. If the exiled community had as its main objective the right to return, the Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza had a principled objective to end the occupation. In 1976, inside Israel, when the Israeli courts attempted a massive land seizure against Palestinians who live within Israel, a big protest campaign begins in 1976, which starts an annual protest called the Land Day, the Day of Land. At that time, Palestinians from 1976 onward inside Israel start to agitate for their civil rights because they don't have civil rights. They are second-class citizens. So we see by the mid-70s, we see in all three sections of Palestinian fragmentation, in exile, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and within Israel, we see the development of an active political calculation, active political life. It's important to understand that, because in this particular instance of uprising that we've seen after the attempted eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah, a village, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, not far from the Haram al-Sharif, the attempted eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah has brought out onto the street Palestinians inside Israel in a renewed civil campaign, has brought Palestinians in the occupied territories into the struggle, including in Gaza, and has brought Palestinians in exile out onto the streets. This particular instance demonstrates that the politics of Palestine, whether it's inside Israel, in exile, or in the occupied Palestinian territories, is alive and well. In other words, the project for Palestinian liberation continues to be inevitable. It continues to be irresistible. People are not capable of forgetting their national aspirations. It's not going to happen. However much Israel pressures people, it is not going to be able to break the will of the Palestinian people. Because the Palestinian people recognize that they are not the authors of this catastrophe. The authors of this catastrophe is the Israeli state project, which itself is born out of European anti-Semitism. Nothing that the Arabs, nothing that the Palestinian did. The Palestinians are not the author of this catastrophe. This catastrophe was imposed on them by the Israeli state project, which itself was the detritus of a long, terrible history of anti-Semitism, pogroms, ghettos, etc., inside Europe, not inside Palestine or the broader Arab world. Now, over the course of the past 2 decades, international law has increasingly imposed itself in trying to define this conflict, so called conflict, in the Arab world, particularly in Palestine. International law has tried to define what is happening. New concepts have emerged. These are important concepts. The concept occupation, for instance, develops right out of the 1967 war. After that, it is established principle to talk about the occupation of the Palestinians. Over the course of the last decade or so, at the United Nations, particularly at the Economic and Social Council, ESQA, headquartered in Beirut, Lebanon, ESQA in 2013 produced a report talking about apartheid inside and around Israel. I'm going to come back to the term apartheid. Then in 2017, ESQA released a second study saying that this is an apartheid situation. This year, Human Rights Watch, which is a New York-based advocacy group, doesn't often stray from the views of the US State Department. This year, Human Rights Watch came on record with a report called Crossing the Threshold. It implicates Israel as an apartheid regime. It says that matters have got so bad that Israel has crossed the threshold, has become now an apartheid regime. Now, what is the nature of this apartheid? Let's go back to that fragmented Palestinian population. First, Palestinians inside Palestine are second-class citizens. Therefore, they experience apartheid. They can't own property. They don't have the same civic and social rights, and so on. So the Palestinians inside Israel are second-class citizens. Therefore, there is apartheid inside Israel. Apartheid being a term derived from South Africa, meaning keeping apart. It's an Afrikaans word that came from the 1948 establishment of the apartheid state in South Africa. That state was established in 1948, coincidentally the same year as Israel was established. So, the second-class citizenship of Palestinians inside Israel is easily definable as apartheid. Secondly, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank are also treated as second-class citizens by the nature of them being occupied. They have to have passes. They are not allowed to travel easily. If you're in the West Bank, you can't travel to East Jerusalem. You can certainly not travel into Israel. You can't go and visit relatives in Gaza and so on. You are encaged. Not just in Gaza, but you're encaged in the West Bank. You're encaged in sections of East Jerusalem. So this engagement of the Palestinians is a form of apartheid as far as the UN is concerned and Human Rights Watch. Finally, anybody who is Jewish has the right to go and seek Israeli citizenship. They have a right to return. But Palestinians do not have a right to return into historic Palestine. The fact that Jews can return but not Palestinians is itself an apartheid condition. So apartheid is experienced not only by Palestinians inside Israel, but by Palestinians inside Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territory of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and by Palestinians in exile. That means all Palestinians, despite fragmentation, all Palestinians are victims of Israeli apartheid. That's a key concept, because if you understand that, you know that the war, so-called war that took place recently, doesn't start with rockets being fired out of Gaza towards Israel. The war is grounded in the condition of apartheid. Apartheid is basically war congealed into structures. And what the Palestinians were doing in Sheikh Jarrah, in the West Bank, in exile, in Gaza, is resisting apartheid, resisting the occupation. And by international law, they have a right to resist. By international law, they have a right to resist. Finally, in the last 5 minutes, India. I began by saying Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson Arindam Bagchi was ridiculous when he said, we're closely following the development of Israel Palestine issues. It's ridiculous. Let's be fair and let's be frank. This Indian government, but also the previous Congress governments, have decided to subordinate themselves to US foreign policy. And one of the key matters of subordinating yourself to US foreign policy is that you therefore have to make peace with Israel. That was made very clear to the government of P.V. Narasimha Rao in the 1990s. He was told the road to Washington, D.C. has to go through Tel Aviv. Now, the BJP government, with its decidedly anti-Muslim orientation, has a much friendlier relation with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Zionist elite in Israel. They are absolutely unified in their approach towards Muslims, not just Palestinians and so on. I mean, look at what the Indian government has done. The CAA, NPR, NRC acts and policies are on the road to making Muslims in India second-class citizens. The abrogation of Article 370, in fact, creates Kashmir, large parts of Kashmir, as an occupied territory. There's a huge military presence in Kashmir, enormous military presence. For what? If you're going to say that Kashmir is a part of India, why do you need to garrison it, in such a way? Why do you need to create in Kashmir what the Palestinians have created with what the Israelis have created in Palestine, which is the politicide, the death of politics of the Palestinians, attempting to kill politics among Palestinians by imprisoning political leaders, a huge number of political prisoner population in Israeli jails of Palestinians, not just Hamas leaders, but leaders from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestinian People's Party, and so on, sitting in Israeli prisons. You're committing politicide against the people. Similar in Kashmir, the arrests of all kinds of political leaders in order to behead, as it were, the popular opposition to what the government of India is doing. India is not behaving well here and has walked away from an entire noble heritage of non-alignment and noble support of liberation struggles around the world, particularly the Palestinian struggle. India has taken a position contrary to human rights. At the Human Rights Council, there was a vote last week to look into the atrocities in this particular bombing run in Gaza and so on, and to talk about reconstruction. India didn't vote for that. India didn't come out and say, yes, there should be an investigation and so on. India didn't even vote against that, didn't have the courage to vote against it, to sit with the Israelis and the United States and so on. India abstained. India, a country of 1.4 billion, one of the founders of the non-aligned movement 60 years ago in 1961, one of the great beacons of decolonization. India abstained on that vote shamefully. India abstained. It abstained because India has such a close alignment with the Israeli government and with the United States. What Holocaust? What ghetto? What pogrom? What is that? If we were genuinely to commemorate the Holocaust, we would have to look deeply into the soul of European anti-Semitism. We'd have to focus the light there. We'd have to talk about Germany. We'd have to talk about the Tsarist Empire. We'd have to talk about Poland. We'd have to talk about Britain, France, the Vichy regime, the Italians. We'd have to talk about the United States, the ship of fools. Deep roots of anti-Semitism, fascism across the landscape. We'd have to talk about the fact that Adolf Hitler justifies the Holocaust based on the genocide against Native Americans in the United States of America. He justifies this in his book, Mein Kampf. We'd have to look at all that. No, the Holocaust is not actually being looked at seriously. The Holocaust is being used again to justify It's being used again to justify the erasure of the Palestinians from our world. Don't allow the Holocaust to be used to justify the oppression of the Palestinians, suffocating the Palestinian right to a national project, to their liberation. Don't allow the Holocaust to be used for that. Certainly commemorate the Holocaust, but point fingers where fingers deserve to be pointed. Point them directly at the European project, at the United States, and so on. They are the ones who, for hundreds of years, persecuted the Jews inside Europe. They are the ones. It was never the Palestinians. The Palestinians should not pay the price. The Palestinians should not pay the price for European anti Semitism. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. So now we have some questions from the audience. So, yeah, I think we are taking this question from Suchintan Das, that Zionists often refer to the Yom Kippur War to put the onus of instigation and escalations on the Arab world, thereby shortening the previous history of unilateral Israeli aggression and occupation. They also conflate Palestinian resistance with Hamas and Hezbollah to solicit legitimacy for Israeli violence. How would you respond to them?
Well, these are two questions. They're two good questions. The first question answers itself because Suchintan has said there that, well, um, the war, both in 1967 and 1973, particularly the 73 war, um, these are not the origins of this particular problem faced by the Palestinians. That problem goes back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, 1617. I mean, what gives the British the right to tell the Palestinians this land is not yours, but it is for the Zionist settlers? I mean, the British, Indians should have sympathy with anybody who is a victim of British imperialism. And, just 2 years after the Balfour Declaration, you have Jallianwala Bagh. It's all of a piece, this idea that, you don't belong here, we'll give it to somebody else. So the idea that the problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis goes back to 1973 or 1967 is totally ahistorical. It has much deeper roots. And as I said, it has two different roots. One is inside Europe, and the other is Europe exporting its problem into the Levant. So that's before 1973. That goes back to 1917. It goes back to the Nakba of 1948 and so on. So that's the question, in a sense, answers itself. Yes, of course, Hasbara or Israeli propaganda says that, look, Hamas, they just want to talk about Hamas. Firstly, Palestinian resistance is of many kinds. There are those Palestinians who resist but are not a member of any political organization. I've traveled to Palestine many times and reported from camps and so on, and met range of different people, many young people who have no political affiliation, but they resist. They are angry about the everyday indignity that they face. They face an everyday indignity. They resist against the occupation. They are not members of a political party. You can't delegitimize them. They exist. Secondly, there are a large number of parties and factions of the left. There is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There's the Palestinian People's Party. There's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Their leaders are all sitting in Israeli prisons. They are not Hamas. They are separate from Hamas, but they are equally persecuted by the Israeli authorities, and nobody really talks about that. Why is Khalida Jarrar still sitting in prison? What is she to do with Hamas? Nothing. In fact, the issue isn't Hamas. It's the act of committing politicide against the Palestinians, trying to erase Palestinian politics. So that's the second section. There's the third section of Palestinian politics, which is those that are around, say, Fatah, the large, big, old Palestinian Liberation Organization faction. Fatah, for instance, being a important arm of Palestinian struggle, has a range of opinions even within it. You see, there is the Fatah of the Palestinian Authority. Much of it is sold out to US imperialism, and it collaborates with the Israelis and so on. There's a lot of that in the Palestinian Authority. But Fatah is much larger than that. So many of their leaders are sitting in prison as well, including Mr. Barghouti and so on. They have an opinion and a struggle, a role in the struggle. And then there is Hamas. Hamas, created in 1987, by the way, promoted by the Israeli government as a alternative to the secular left, to the National Liberation Project of Fatah, of the PFLP, DFLP, and so on. Israel initially promoted Hamas. This is not some fantasy statement. This is on the record. Israeli officials talking about it. Hamas is a product mainly of the Muslim Brotherhood. It comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood project. Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, is essentially in power in Qatar. Muslim Brotherhood is effectively in power in Turkey. I mean, this is a legitimate political project in the Arab world. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna and his colleagues in Egypt, isn't some crackerjack project. It's basically a legitimate political force. Now, I happen not to agree with their politics, but that's irrelevant. It's a legitimate political project. It, as I said, sits in power in Turkey. It has a big role in Egypt. You would have seen after the uprising in Tahrir Square, the government of Mohammed Morsi that won the election. Mohammed Morsi and his government is a Muslim Brotherhood government. Hamas is just the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Turns out Hamas rejected, there were many reasons why Hamas emerged as a powerful force in the occupied territories. Because the Israeli government and Jordan and Lebanon together, in collusion in some ways, ejected the PLO from the region, first from the camps largely, but not fully successfully, then from Jordan after Black September. And you may know the Pakistani army played a role in this. They were led by Zia-ul Haq personally in the war against the Palestinians in Jordan in 1970. Then they go to Lebanon in 1982 during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila and so on. The PLO is sent to Tunis. The PLO was detached from the occupied Palestinian territory. First, you get Hamas promoted by the Israelis, the PLO absent from the territories. When the first Intifada breaks out in the late 1980s, Hamas is there and it's on the streets with people. It has a certain legitimacy, cannot be underestimated. And by the way, these rockets being fired out of Gaza are not only fired by Hamas, they are fired by a range of the different factions, political factions. It's a form of resistance to the occupation. It's not just Hamas. There is a way in which the Israeli government has attempted to say that Hamas is a terrorist organization and therefore Palestinian resistance is illegitimate. This has to be contested. Firstly, one has to contest the idea that Hamas is anywhere near the capture of the majority of opinion of people in Palestine. It's not. It's not the main organization. There are a range of organizations, and many of them conduct resistance, and they use different forms and so on. And secondly, to restrict the Hamas itself to being a Islamist organization is not true as well, because just because it's Islamist, it draws in a whole range of people to become Hamas members, partly because it is the major resistance force inside Gaza in particular. So we got to have a nuanced understanding of Hamas and reject this idea that Palestinian resistance can be associated with Hamas, Hamas associated with terrorism, therefore Palestinian resistance can be delegitimized. This has to be resisted, this idea, because this is classic propaganda. It's classic propaganda. And the answer to this isn't to turn around and say, no, Hamas is good. That's not the answer. The answer is to reject the idea that Palestinian resistance can be circumscribed into Hamas. That's wrong. There are a range of factions. And secondly, the range of factions resist in different ways, including by rocket fire. And that itself is sanctified by international law, because the Palestinians have a right to resist their occupation. So, Sumaya, that was the answer to that.
Uh, there's another question from Agnitra Saha. Will Iranian aggression towards Israel help the Palestinian cause, although Iran itself is a theocratic regime?
Well, Sumaya, this is the same kind of thought that restricts the Palestinian struggle to Hamas, to restrict Palestinian support internationally to Israel, to Iran. This Iran is just one of many countries that provide support to the Palestinian cause. Is one of many countries. Syria provides support to the Palestinian cause. Lebanon, and then countries all around the world, South Africa, Cuba, Venezuela. I mean, many countries support the cause of the Palestinians openly, explicitly. China supports the cause of the Palestinians and has been quite vocal in the recent period, standing up for Palestine and so on. So, yes, Iran is just another country, and it's also another government supporting the Palestinian people. Now, the Israelis have attempted to say that the Palestinians are Hamas, and international support for Hamas comes only from from Iran. So they have tried to reduce global support for the Palestinian cause to Iran, and that's itself a limiting factor. That itself is a limiting factor.
So the next question is from Arham Khan. Zionists frequently make the claim that anti-Zionist movements are shelters for anti-Semitism, and in this way they take away legitimacy from criticism of Israel. How can one effectively respond to this?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, the point is, I have just given you a story of how anti Semitism is rooted in European history. Anti Semitism's origin and persistence is inside Europe. I mean, today, for instance, there has been a rise of anti Semitism consequent to a rise of right wing, these neo fascist groups. Um, look at the RSS, for instance. If you read Golwalkar's book, the one that was published in the 1950s, Golwalkar says that what the government of India, Hindu government of India, should do, Golwalkar fantasizes, is this Hindu government should do to Muslims in India what the Germans did to the Jews. In other words, who is the anti-Semite? Golwalkar is in that moment. In that moment, Golwalkar is articulating an anti-Semitic politics, because he is saying essentially that it's okay. It's okay for he's saying at that point it's okay for a future Hindu government to conduct the massacre of millions of Jews, because that example should be borrowed for the massacre of Muslims in India. So who's the real anti-Semite here? I mean, let's think about it. I don't feel like any anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. I think the real anti-Semites are the anti-Semites, and that includes the RSS and the Golwalkar Bhakts. They are the real anti-Semites, not the people who are fighting for the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah, I think our next question is from Mayuk Bhatak. What does the US get out of investing billions in Israel? Does it get invested back in US, or does the US have some sort of monopoly?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for this. But what does one say about the fact that the United States does invest billions of dollars annually in in Israel? Why? Well, look, there are several reasons. One is it has to do with domestic politics in the U.S. It's not just Jews who live in the United States that promote Israel. That's not correct. The largest pro-Israeli bloc in the United States are evangelical Christians who actually have an anti-Semitic approach towards their support for Israel, because they have this bizarre idea that first the Jews must go back to the homeland, Israel, and build the temple of the Jews, and then God will destroy all the Jews and take the Christians to heaven. I mean, it's a bizarrely genocidal viewpoint that they have, but they are the largest block of supporters for Israel. A lot of the support for Israel doesn't come from American Jews, where there is a split and a divide, and there's a large number of young Jews in the United States who are very opposed to Israeli government policy. So one is this domestic constituency, largely of Christian Zionists, evangelical Christian Zionists. Second, there's a military issue here. The United States initially was not comfortable with having Israel as a major ally because they thought it would alienate Arab states. But over time, it's become clear that Israel operates as an aircraft carrier for the United States in the Levant, has a very important forward role. So there's a military aspect to this, a geopolitical military aspect to this. Finally, Israel has a very well developed arms industry, and the United States arms companies play a big role in joint ventures in Israeli weapons production. And you see, Israel provides a fantastic service to US imperialism for this, and India is a beneficiary of it. You see, after India exploded the nuclear bomb for the second time in 1998 during the BJP government of Vajpayee, at that moment, India suddenly had to face a US law that said that nuclear proliferators could not get access to dual use military technology and other military equipment. But because a lot of that equipment was produced in Israel in joint ventures with US armaments companies, weapons companies, the Israeli companies could sell to India. So Israel from 98 began to sell arms to India, which India couldn't get from the US, because India essentially is a violator of international law with its nuclear weapons program. And so half of Israel's military exports are bought by India. And this is a great advantage to US arms companies. So there's several complicated reasons for why the United States backs Israel. They don't expect necessarily a rate of return on their investment. This is a political investment. You don't have an economic attitude towards this investment.
Yeah, and now we have a question from Rajashri Adhikari. An unified movement for Palestinian liberation lies dead and buried. The West Bank and Gaza are divided amongst themselves. Do you see any concerted efforts on the part of China? More diplomatic pressures and all. We thought a proactive China-Palestinian issue is done and dusted.
Well, Rajashri, I don't agree with the last phase that without China, Palestinian issue is done and dusted, because, as I said, the Palestinians have been fighting whether they have international support or not. So I don't think it's going to be so easy for the Palestinian approach to be squashed. I mean, even Palestinians inside Israel proper have once more opened up a civil struggle, which I think is going to now deepen and create big problems inside Israel itself. So it's nowhere near gone. On the other hand, I think it is true, and you're right, that the intervention of China here diplomatically is very important. And one would like to see China active in the UN Security Council, in various UN agencies. One would like to see China assert itself into these matters. After all, Israel and Palestine are in Asia. China is a leading Asian country, and China has lots of relations with Arab countries and so on. It needs to play a big role here. I recall seeing China's role in the war in Syria. China played a very balanced and good role. So one is looking forward to it. And I have to say, the Chinese diplomats are highly sophisticated. I met the Chinese ambassador in Beirut in Lebanon, fluent in Arabic. They have a great eye for what's happening in the region. China has developed very close ties because of the Belt and Road Initiative, has developed very close ties with Iran, has developed close ties with Iraq, with Syria, of course, and with Turkey. Even though these countries have internal contradictions, China has friendly relations with them all. Therefore, I think it's very important for China to assert itself. Now, on behalf of what? That's interesting. There is dispute in the Palestinian project over one state, two state, and so on. As I said, the one state approach is very attractive, but it's utopian. It would take a lot for that to be actually established. What you will end up having is a one state which has internal apartheid, because the Israeli state project is simply not willing to accept Palestinians as full citizens. So, that's why the two state is really the thing on the table. And right now, the Chinese are essentially backers of the two state solution. They are up there on that. So let's see what happens. But I do think that whether China comes in a focused way or not, the Palestinian issue is not going to die out. But I also think that Chinese intervention is very important.
So now I have a question for you.
Okay.
We have noticed recently the Israeli use of the Holocaust as a propaganda tool for amassing sympathy for its genocide against the people of Palestine. Do you think there are any ways and means of destabilizing their stronghold on academic knowledge pertaining to the Holocaust?
Right. So, as I said, the Holocaust is a horrible, horrible, horrible blight on human history. The Holocaust, which directly takes place in the late from 1939, maybe a little earlier, even really the gathering up, the ejecting of German citizens of Jewish background and so on, the terrible gathering up of Jewish peoples across Europe, in France, in Italy, and sending them by train into Germany to the extermination camps. This view of Jews as beneath human and so on, a horrible history that plagues Europe. And the Holocaust is, in that sense, the low point, the lowest point of European civilization. Yes, but it's of course sharing a burden with colonialism, which is another low point. I just want to put on the record that perhaps 6 million people were butchered by the Belgians in the Congo in the space of 6 years in the late 19th century. 6 million people butchered in the Congo by the Belgians. So the colonialism and the Holocaust were the low points of European civilization. Now, we've got to keep adding to that. There's also the genocide against the peoples of the Americas, which was, a function of the European project also. The conquistadors, the settlers in the Northern American plains and so on, the massacres of native people, all of that has to be at the table as the low points of European civilization. All of this, Samaya, is something that Europe has to deal with. And I want to reiterate this. The Holocaust must not be used as a weapon to justify what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. The Holocaust must be understood for what it is, which is a European project. It is not a Palestinian project. It must not be used. We should refuse to allow it to be used, to be weaponized against the Palestinians. If anything, it should be used for Europe to look at its own soul. That's about it. Case closed. It's a very significant part of European history. Must be looked at. We must commemorate it, must study it, and so on. But we must study it as a European project, not as a Levantine project.
Yeah. So our Q&A session ends here now. So thank you so much, Comrade, for taking out time to address us. It was indeed a very insightful and enriching session. And also, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. We end our today's session with a call for free Palestine and end of Israeli occupation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Sumaya. Thanks to SFI St Stephens.